Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. It has been a week since Harvey made landfall in southeastern Texas, and the cleanup continues as the water starts receding in many of the most damaged areas. But people nationwide, they are feeling the effects. Gas prices rising during the shutdown of Gulf refineries. A lot of developments today, so let's go live to Bel Air, Texas with Marcy Gonzalez.
Hi there. There is a lot of hard work happening today by homeowners and by strangers who've been showing up, offering to help, throwing everything away from drywall to mattresses to family photos, all destroyed. While in some communities east of here, they are still in crisis mode.
Beaumont buried, dealing with a double dose of water troubles. The flooding still stranding people in their homes, and the water system paralyzed, nothing flowing into faucets in most parts of the city. The desperation leading to nearly 4-hour-long lines just to pick up bottled water. The ongoing problems forcing the evacuation of every shelter there. Families loaded onto military planes flown to Dallas and San Antonio.
We underestimated. We didn't thought it was going to be this devastating.
In hard-hit Houston, new calls for evacuations in some inundated neighborhoods.
Things are not going to change over the next 10 to 15 days.
And in East Texas communities now drying out. Families returning home, starting to clear out their soaked belongings.
Everything we own, it's gone, but it's okay.
And some uninvited guests, including this monstrous 11-foot gator.
Looked at it and asked me, "Is that thing real?" And I said, "Yes."
Finally captured and carried away.
And those brave guys say they're actually getting a lot of calls like that about other animals. It's just one more challenge as people start coming back to the more than 185,000 homes in this state that were damaged or destroyed. We're live in Bel Air, Texas. Marcy Gonzalez, ABC News. Now back to you.
Thank you, Marcy. The scope of the problem we're only beginning to get our arms around. Now, Harvey could become the costliest natural disaster in American history. AccuWeather says the price tag could approach $200 billion, that's with a B, dollars. Katrina, as a frame of reference, cost $160 billion. Sandy, about half that number. The numbers there are staggering. More than 40,000 people have needed emergency shelter. More than 150,000 homes have been flooded, and it's estimated that only 1 in 5 homes in the area are covered by flood insurance. What does that mean? Well, a whole lot of people will need a whole lot of help from who else but the federal government. And Texas lawmakers, they're pushing for billions of dollars when it comes to federal aid. Those are a lot of the same people, I should remind you, who voted against funding for Superstorm Sandy just a few years ago. Back then, Senator Ted Cruz, he led the way, and he's still answering questions about why it wasn't good for New York and New Jersey then, but it's good for Texas now.
I and a number of others enthusiastically and emphatically supported hurricane relief for Sandy. Hurricane relief and disaster relief has been a vital federal role for a long, long time, and it should continue. The problem with that particular bill is it became a $50 billion bill that was filled with unrelated pork. 2/3 of that bill had nothing to do with Sandy. And what I said then and still believe now is that it's not right for politicians to exploit a disaster and people are hurting to pay for their own political wish list.
By the way, that's exactly what people accused Ted Cruz of then and still to this day. And by the way, PolitiFact says the claim that you just heard from Ted Cruz is almost entirely false, and Cruz drastically exaggerating the situation, the funding that would have been appropriate for anything but relief. Now, I find this next thing shocking, but Chris Christie and I agree on this. Listen to what the New Jersey governor had to say specifically about Ted Cruz and revisionist history.
I see Senator Cruz, and it's disgusting to me that he stands in a recovery center with victims standing behind him as a backdrop, and he's still repeating the same reprehensible lies about what happened in Sandy.
Let's bring in our panel to unpack all of this. Jerica Richardson, former spokesperson for Mayor Bill de Blasio, also U.S. Attorney Preet Bharara, Andrew Whitman, senior political correspondent, and Dominic Carter, political journalist and author. And we're going to have a very busy week next week, Andrew, in Washington. There's a limited amount of time and a whole lot of things that Washington has to get done. Give an idea for time frame to get their arms around budget issues. They're talking tax reform, even if that's down the road. But they got to get this funding, and they got to get this relief funding out there. And you're going to have a lot of lawmakers who voted 180 degrees not too many years ago for a very similar storm. It just happened to be a different part of the country.
Well, and we're going to get into this in more detail a little bit later on in the program, but it appears as though there's enough bipartisan consensus to get the first batch of Harvey funding through. I think $12.4 billion is what the White House is asking for in this first go. But again, you're going to have a lot of these lawmakers, including Cornyn and Cruz out of Texas, who voted against Sandy aid, and some of them, by the way, voted against Hurricane Katrina aid, who are now seeking the money. Again, it looks like it's going to wind up going through, but that's likely to be one of the first things that happens when lawmakers come back to town or come back to Washington next week.
And Jerica, this got to be, I know a lot of this stuff is for folks like us and people who tend to traffic in the detail, but I got to think it's got to funnel down. Wait a minute. Same guy says no. Basically, you're on your own. I'm not going to find any funding for you unless you show me some offset cuts here. And now all of a sudden, I want the money, no strings attached. We have a human disaster. I thought Peter King, the Republican from Long Island, said it really well when he said, listen, I'm going to vote for the funding here without restrictions for these people in need. But let's not forget what the same people who have their hand out right now said to us when we needed help. And they weren't there for us, and it took weeks until they finally could figure it out in Washington. Will that get measured out here? Are we in such a busy window and also fractured media culture that some of the reality and the hypocrisy won't get out?
Well, it's hypocrisy at its finest. I don't think voters are going to forget about that. And as you said before, I've never been a fan of Chris Christie, but on this issue, he was right. This is the type of issue where you need to put partisan politics aside because it's people that we're dealing with.
And Dominic, I hear still some Republican lawmakers are saying, I want offsets for this. Meaning, for every dollar that I'm going to put towards recovery, show me cuts. And we know where they're going to be looking for cuts. You know, they're not going to be looking to raise taxes here or revenues on the wealthiest. They're going to be looking on cuts that will be. These people don't have time for this. I mean, we have the recovery efforts that we're showing, the visuals here. I mean, people in Beaumont, hundreds of thousands of people have no water right now. I mean, literally, it's draconian. I know people doing victory laps in Washington, the administration, how great things are, but I really think optically they better be careful because the hardest part is what's still to come. If we remember back in Katrina, the heck of a job Rowney came after the waters had stopped raining, and we knew the problems were the lack of planning and the lack of resources to help the recovery. Where are you going to put more than 100,000 people? Where are you going to put all these people, you know? So to me, I'm just not sure. You know, people better get on the same page in a hurry in Washington. I'm not sure they're there.
Well, I believe, Richard, with this situation, and here's a prediction, we'll see if I'm right, that the partisan politics in this case is going to have to go out the window. And in terms of, let's talk about Republicans for a second, demanding offsets and, you know, to balance out and spending cuts from social programs to pay for Harvey. I think it's so devastating in Texas that I don't see a situation where politicians can get in the way and fight this or block this. I think the Ted Cruzes of the world have already been exposed as total phony hypocrites.
Okay.
And that's it.
But it's penalty free for the Cruzes and the Cornyns of the world, or the you know, House members from Texas who voted no on Sandy aid, because that was then and that was for a different part of the country,
right.
And this is for Texas, and so this is a much more pressing concern. They've already faced the voters after rejecting Sandy aid. Voters didn't seem to mind, and again, it's very local voting blocks. It's the state of Texas or it's the individual congressional district.
You know, Andrew, in the days and weeks to come, we're going to be focusing on the recovery, what needs to happen, the best ways to get the recovery. But again, if we're pointing out hypocrisy, let me give me just a few more minutes on this for a second. Not just with the same people who said no to New York and in our area when we were underwater, and the same thing, as Jerica mentions, for the folks in Katrina, but the regulations put in from the previous administration and FEMA itself. Remind our audience what this president's only been there for 8 months, what he chose to do with FEMA's budget and also with regulations that would help low-lying areas like Houston make sure that private industry concerns didn't trump, not just environmental, but basic safety.
3 examples that I can think of. The Trump budget proposal that will be voted, it's being folded into the debate over the budget next month, or later this month rather, calls for $800+ billion in cuts to FEMA. And there are other cuts that are related to storm and recovery efforts that we'll get into a little bit later in the program. So that's the overarching one. Now all of a sudden they're looking for an extra bill for Harvey relief specific to this storm, but again, FEMA is the center, as we all know, that handles all of these problems. Second are these coastal zone restrictions that the Obama administration put into place. They basically said, if you're in a coastal flood zone area, you need to raise the level of your infrastructure by a couple of feet in most cases. If you're building a road, or if you're building a plant, or if you're building a hospital, it's got to be elevated a little bit more than it previously had to be. The business community hates that because it's an extra expense, and that makes it more difficult to get these clearances through and to get construction started. And about 2 weeks ago, the Trump administration announced they were reversing that policy. And so that regulation was no longer going to be in place, so that, you know, had that rule been in place earlier, it would have been easier to build a lot of stuff in floodplain zones. The third is a chemical safety board that they're relaxing restrictions on. There's chemical company regulations, basically. I point this out because there's a chemical plant in East Texas where there's already been 1 explosion, and the plant owners say there's nothing else we can do, and there are going to be 8 or 9 or 10 more explosions that are expected in the next couple of days. All they can do is walk away from it and let the thing blow up. And the Trump administration is seeking to reverse restrictions and regulations that on things like safety procedures, or on, you know, how to handle volatile chemicals like this. The exact kind of thing that would have prevented the explosions and the dispersion of chemicals across 1.5 mile area of East Texas.
And I just want people, if you're going to take just one thing away from this, okay? This has nothing to do with Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. We heard in the last election and for a while now, oh, government. They just get in your way. You got to get the federal government out and let people just do what they need to do. Let the local people do what they need to do. What would we be doing right now without FEMA? Explain that to me. Explain to me right now, as Andrew just laid out, if you let people work to their own devices and not worry about safety regulations or not deal with realities like rising coastal levels, etc., what do you think happens? And who ends up picking up the bill? It's you and me. So the idea that let's just get out of the way and let everybody do whatever they want, when it releases safety and practicality and finally just cold hard cash, yours and mine, think about how it all turns out. We'll come back to that later. But coming up next, another major issue that the president will have to make a decision on. He is expected to end the Dreamer program. That allows hundreds of thousands of young undocumented immigrants to stay in this country. He's said a lot of things in terms of protecting his population, but now he says maybe not so much. He's got a lot of opposition, including some of big names within his own party.